What happens when bold ideas collide with bad execution? In this countdown, we uncover 32 of the most awkward, overstyled, and downright baffling cars of the 1950s you've probably never seen before. From chrome disasters to design experiments gone wrong, these forgotten machines prove that not every car deserves a comeback. Buckle up, it's gonna get weird. Number 32. 1950 Nash Rambler. In an era when American cars were all about size, chrome, and flair, the 1950 Nash Rambler showed up like a party guest in pajamas, completely out of sync with the crowd. While everyone else was pumping out road-hogging sedans with towering tail fins and thunderous V8s, Nash decided to go small, rounded, and almost comically cute. The Rambler's compact footprint made it look toy-like compared to its contemporaries, and the fender skirts that covered both front and rear wheels made it seem like it was hiding something, possibly its dignity. With a design that wrapped the body around the wheels like a shrunken bathtub, it earned nicknames like Pregnant Peanut and Rolling Jelly Bean from those who couldn't quite tell whether it was a car or an overinflated vacuum cleaner. What made the Rambler even more puzzling was its pricing. Despite its small size and economy engine focus, it wasn't exactly a bargain. Nash positioned it as a premium compact, but buyers were skeptical of paying full-size prices for half-size fun. Inside, the seats folded down into a makeshift bed, an idea ahead of its time, but executed in a cabin so tight you'd have to be a contortionist to enjoy it. And under the hood, its modest inline-six offered just enough grunt to keep it moving, but not enough to make anyone excited. In fairness, the Nash Rambler would later be celebrated as a pioneer of the American compact car movement. But in 1950, it was a misunderstood misfit, out of step with public expectations, and overshadowed by its more flamboyant competition. If a car could suffer from an identity crisis, the Nash Rambler surely did. It wasn't sporty, luxurious, or especially cheap, it was just weird. And for that reason, it earns its place on this list of the stupidest cars of the decade. Number 31. 1950 Studebaker Starlight Coupe. The 1950 Studebaker Starlight Coupe is one of those cars that leaves you wondering if the designers were playing a prank on the public. At a time when most automakers were cautiously re-entering the civilian market after World War II, Studebaker took a leap off the deep end with a design that looked like it couldn't decide which direction it wanted to go. The Starlight's most infamous feature was its bizarre wraparound rear window, an uninterrupted loop of glass that curved from one side of the car to the other, encasing the entire rear passenger area like a greenhouse turret. It was less of a back window and more of a rear observation deck, leading some critics to joke that the car looked like it was going forward and backward at the same time. The result was a vehicle that was unintentionally hilarious from almost every angle. The front of the car looked like a bullet or an airplane fuselage, while the rear glass bubble made it resemble a rolling conservatory. It's as if the design department got confused halfway through the sketch and just decided to use both ends. Though Studebaker marketed the Starlight as a futuristic and stylish vision of tomorrow, most people just stared at it and asked, why? Despite its questionable styling, the Starlight wasn't a total disaster in terms of performance. But that's not what people remember. They remember the absurdity of that all-glass tail section, which made sitting in the back seat feel like being on display in a zoo exhibit. It was hard to tell if Studebaker was trying to push design boundaries or just trolling the competition. Either way, the Starlight Coupe has cemented its place as one of the most visually confusing and stupidest cars of the 1950s. Number 30. 1954 Nash Metropolitan. The 1954 Nash Metropolitan looked less like a car and more like something you'd win in a carnival game. At just under 13 feet long, it was dwarfed by every other American vehicle on the road, making it seem almost cartoonish in comparison. Born from a strange idea that Americans might embrace a tiny European-style economy car, the Metropolitan was actually manufactured in England by Austin and shipped back across the Atlantic to be sold under the Nash name. That alone made it an anomaly in a decade where size equaled prestige. The styling didn't help its case either. With a two-tone paint job, a narrow wheelbase, and stubby proportions, it had the oddball charm of a clown car. Its tiny 12-inch wheels looked like they belonged on a wheelbarrow rather than a road-going automobile. And under the hood, the Metropolitan was powered by an anemic 4-cylinder engine producing barely 40 horsepower, which meant 0 to 60 times that could be measured with a calendar. Inside, things got even weirder. Despite being marketed as a 2-seater, the interior felt surprisingly cramped, with minimal cargo space and an awkward driving position. The dashboard was stark and simple, lacking any of the flashy chrome or futuristic gimmicks that defined the decade. Nash tried to position it as an economical second car for women, but in doing so, alienated a huge portion of the buying public. Over time, the Metropolitan developed a cult following, but in its early days, it was mocked relentlessly. It simply didn't fit into the American automotive landscape of the 1950s, a land of tail fins, vates, and bravado. The Metropolitan might have been ahead of its time in theory, but in practice, it just looked like a bad punchline on wheels. Number 29. 1952 Hudson Wasp. The 1952 Hudson Wasp was the kind of car that looked like it had just woken up from a decade-long nap and wandered into the wrong party. While the rest of Detroit was cranking out chrome-plated fantasies with skyscraping tail fins and jet-age pretensions, Hudson stuck stubbornly to its step-down monobuilt design, a slab-sided, low-slung form that hadn't changed much since the late 40s. The Wasp was supposed to be the middle child of the Hudson family, but it felt more like the awkward cousin nobody invited. Hudson's engineers were proud of their unibody construction, but by 1952, it came off less as innovation and more like stagnation. The Wasp's rounded roofline, bulging fenders, and high beltline made it look like a giant steel potato on wheels. It lacked the flair, the flash, the sheer spectacle that Americans were growing to expect from their cars. Even its name, Wasp, felt like a cruel joke. There was nothing remotely insect-like about this lumbering machine, unless you count the buzzing complaints of anyone stuck behind its wheel. Mechanically, it was fine. Serviceable, reliable, but wholly uninspiring. Its straight-six engine made decent power, but it was housed in a shell that felt completely out of step with the design renaissance sweeping through American showrooms. Buyers in 1952 weren't interested in safe, conservative shapes. They wanted spectacle, excitement, something that would turn heads. Instead, the Hudson Wasp turned stomachs. It wasn't ugly in a monstrous way. It was ugly in a tired, what are you even doing here kind of way. A leftover in a world sprinting forward. The Wasp didn't sting. It just kind of hovered there, buzzing awkwardly in the background, waiting for someone to swat it away. Number 28. 1954 Nash Rambler Cross-Country Wagon. The 1954 Nash Rambler Cross-Country Wagon looked like it had been cobbled together in a panic by someone with access to leftover parts and zero design instinct. Take the already awkward Nash Rambler sedan, a car that resembled a rolling bar of soap, and slap a flat box on the back like an afterthought. Voila, you had the cross-country. This wagon didn't just lack grace, it lacked purpose. From the side, it looked like a loaf of bread that had been punched in the middle and stretched at both ends. The proportions were completely out of balance. The short front end, bulbous fenders, and abruptly squared-off rear gave the impression that Nash's design team had been interrupted halfway through the sketch. There was no flow, no rhythm, just a series of lines that didn't talk to each other. The roofline sat like a lid someone forgot to trim. The windows were narrow, the pillars thick, and visibility out the back was about as good as peering through a keyhole. Inside, it was utilitarian to the point of punishment. The materials felt like something you'd find in a municipal building or a forgotten basement. Fold-down seats were meant to be a clever feature, but the execution made it feel like converting a broom closet into a sleeping bag. And don't expect to haul anything bulky unless you were willing to play a game of luggage Tetris. It wasn't fast, it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't good looking. The cross-country was the visual equivalent of white bread dipped in skim milk. No flair, no risk, just beige on wheels. A wagon built for those who had given up on aesthetics entirely. Number 27. 1954 Buick Roadmaster. The 1954 Buick Roadmaster looked like it had just been given some very bad news. The front end drooped like it was melting under its own chrome-heavy sadness, with a grille that curved downward into a soft grimace, and headlight surrounds that sagged like tired eyelids. It didn't roar down the road, it sulked. This was supposed to be Buick's luxury flagship, but it resembled an overweight battleship that had lost the will to fight. Everything about the Roadmaster screamed excess without control. The body was bloated and bulky, with sweeping curves that had all the aerodynamic grace of a refrigerator. Buick's famous Ventaports on the front fenders only made matters worse. 4 portholes that looked more like gills on a struggling sea creature than styling flourishes. And don't forget the acres of chrome. Not tastefully applied, mind you, slathered on like someone was being paid by the pound. Inside, the Roadmaster promised first-class comfort but delivered a dated cabin drenched in brocade patterns and faux luxury trim that felt more funeral home than futuristic. The dashboard was a clutter of knobs, switches, and dials that seemed designed to confuse rather than assist. Power came from a straight-8 engine, which by 1954 already felt ancient compared to the rising tide of V8s. Acceleration was leisurely, steering was vague, and the whole thing drove like a floating couch on underinflated tires. It's not that the Roadmaster was useless, it just looked and felt like it had given up. A bloated barge of a car that seemed unsure why it still existed. If a midlife crisis could be forged in steel and chrome, this was it. A flagship lost at sea. Number 26. 1955 Packard 400. By the time the 1955 Packard 400 showed up, the once proud automaker was already limping toward irrelevance, and this car didn't help matters. What should have been a symbol of luxury and elegance looked more like a last-ditch attempt to impress the prom queen with a borrowed tux and spray-painted shoes. The 400 was a Frankenstein of design, a bloated relic from a better decade, now awkwardly slathered in mid-century glitter in a desperate attempt to stay relevant. It had more chrome than a diner, backsplash, and styling lines that changed direction halfway through the car. The two-tone paint scheme tried to give it some flair, but it just highlighted the body's aging bones. The rear fenders swelled like overstuffed luggage, and the grille was a gaping rectangle that looked like it was waiting for a sandwich, not air. Its proportions were weirdly top-heavy, and the styling cues seemed borrowed from a mix of other brands, none of which wanted them back. Underneath the glitter, things didn't get any more coherent. The car rode on a platform that had barely changed since the 40s. The suspension was soft and floaty, which made for a wobbly ride, and the steering was vague enough to make you feel like you were negotiating with the wheels instead of turning them. The engine was a V8, new for Packard, but it couldn't mask the fact that this car handled like a sofa being dragged by a farm mule. The Packard 400 wasn't ugly in the fun way, it was sad ugly. A car trying to hide its age behind glitter and attitude. It wasn't a reinvention. It was a cover-up. Number 25. 1956 Kaiser Darren. The 1956 Kaiser Darren looked like a sketchbook idea that somehow escaped the drawing board and made it to production. Styled by Howard Dutch Darren, the car was meant to be bold and exotic, but what it delivered was a strange blend of melted plastic and half-baked gimmicks. It had a snout-like front end with a puckered grille that looked like it was trying to whistle. The fiberglass bodywork had the consistency of a cereal box and flexed like a beach toy under pressure. But the real eyebrow raiser was the doors. Instead of swinging open like every other car on Earth, the Darren's doors slid forward into the front fenders, like a magician's trick that no one asked for. They looked cool until it rained, or snowed, or jammed, which they did often. You'd think such an idea would have been tested thoroughly, but this was a car driven more by novelty than practicality. Inside, it was cramped and unfinished, like someone had stopped halfway through installing the interior and just called it done. Power came from a small Willys F-head 4-cylinder engine that wheezed out barely enough grunt to keep up with a delivery van. For something marketed as a sports car, the Darren was embarrassingly slow and fragile. It looked like it belonged on a California beach, but drove like it belonged in the back of a garage, under a tarp. Only a few hundred were ever made, and it's easy to see why. The Kaiser Darren was a car nobody needed, wrapped in a body nobody understood, with doors that made you question your life choices every time you tried to get in. It wasn't forward thinking. It was sideways thinking. Number 24. 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser. The 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser looked like it had been built by a committee of mad scientists, each given a different era to design from. It was Mercury's idea of a luxury car from the future, but instead of landing ahead of its time, it crash-landed in a heap of misplaced ambition and excess. From the massive tail fins that looked like jet stabilizers to the reverse slant rear window that retracted down into the roof, the Turnpike Cruiser was a rolling monument to just because we can. That rear window alone was worth a second glance, and not in a good way. Marketed as the breezeway feature, it let fresh air into the cabin by sliding the glass down behind the back seat. Problem was, it also let in rain, dust, and noise, and if it malfunctioned, which it often did, you were stuck with either a permanently open hole or a motorized rattle trap in the roof. The dashboard was stuffed with switches and dials, including a bizarre steering wheel with a flattened top and a transmission selector that looked like a science project gone sideways. Under the hood, you got a big V8, but all that power didn't save it from feeling like a whale on roller skates. The ride was boaty, the handling was numb, and the whole thing weighed more than some delivery truck. Getting in and out of it felt like boarding a Cold War-era prototype for an amphibious assault vehicle. Mercury threw everything at the Turnpike Cruiser except restraint. It was a case study in trying too hard, proof that just because you can bolt something onto a car doesn't mean you should. It wasn't futuristic. It was absurd. Number 23. 1958 Mercury Montclair. The 1958 Mercury Montclair didn't just arrive. It barged into traffic like it had something to prove, and no clue how to prove it. This was Mercury trying to out-Detroit the rest of Detroit, piling on styling trends like toppings at a sundae bar. Fins? Yes. And not just subtle ones. Giant, upturned wedges that looked like they could double as launch pads. Chrome? Everywhere. The front bumper alone could blind a man at 50 paces. From the side, the Montclair looked like it had been sculpted with a machete. Sharp creases cut across swollen fenders, interrupted by thick trim that served no purpose other than reflecting sunlight directly into the eyes of passing motorists. The rear end looked like someone had tried to merge a jukebox with a rocket sled. It was all flash and no finesse, a brute of a car that wore its weight like a badge of honor. The inside was no refuge, either. The dashboard was a clutter of chrome bezels, overstyled gauges, and buttons that felt like they were placed for decoration, not function. Upholstery patterns clashed like a bad wallpaper convention, and everything felt one step away from garish overload. This wasn't luxury, it was noise in fabric form. And while the big V8 under the hood had muscle, it was dragging around so much sheet metal it could barely stretch its legs. Handling was laughable, parking was a nightmare, and fuel economy was something best discussed with a priest. The Montclair wasn't a car, it was a dare. A challenge to taste, proportion, and common sense. An over-accessorized peacock on wheels, completely unaware of the joke it had become. Number 22. 1959 Plymouth Fury. The 1959 Plymouth Fury looked like it had been carved out of a comic book nightmare. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't graceful, and it sure wasn't modest. This car came at you like a carnival ride gone rogue, with fins so tall they could cast shade over a compact sedan. Plymouth's designers didn't so much draw the Fury as they attacked the drafting paper with a ruler and a dare. The front grille was an angry grin, wide, sharp, and menacing. The twin headlamps looked perpetually stunned, like the car couldn't believe it existed either. From the back, the Fury resembled a spaceship with body dysmorphia, taillights perched like devil horns, and chrome trim zigzagging as if someone designed it during an earthquake. Everything about this car was loud, even when the engine wasn't running. And yes, thanks to a certain horror movie, the Fury earned a haunted reputation, but in truth, the real curse was its own design. Driving it felt like piloting a parade float that didn't know when to quit. It was enormous, hard to park, and had the turning radius of a tugboat. The V8 under the hood gave it some go, but you needed every bit of that power just to wrestle the beast around a corner. Inside, the dashboard was a festival of odd switches and sweeping lines that looked like they were drawn with a compass and no second thoughts. Materials were flashy but flimsy, form without function. The 1959 Fury was too much car in all the wrong places. A machine that shouted its arrival, but never stopped to ask if anyone was actually impressed. Number 21. 1958 Plymouth Savoy. The 1958 Plymouth Savoy looked like someone tried to draw a car from memory after staring at a more expensive model for 10 seconds. It was the plain bologna sandwich of the Plymouth lineup, technically a car, but entirely lacking spice or effort. While its siblings, like the Belvedere and Fury, got the wild fins and extra shine, the Savoy felt like it was cobbled together out of leftovers and sent out the door with a shrug. Its lines were inconsistent and jittery, like a styling student got nervous halfway through the sketch. The grille was too big for its face, with horizontal bars that looked like cheap blinds from a motel room. The headlights seemed tacked on like an afterthought, wide set and vacant, giving the car a dull, stunned expression. From the rear, the Savoy sported fins, sure, but they looked apologetic, like they were trying to participate in a trend they didn't really believe in. The body panels felt slabby, the trim was minimal and awkward, and the whole car gave off the vibe of something designed over a lunch break. Even the interior had all the charm of a waiting room, with hard plastics and seat fabrics that looked like upholstery rejects. It had a steering wheel and pedals, but joy never entered the equation. Under the hood, it could be optioned with a decent V8, but the Savoy was too heavy and too lazy looking to ever feel quick. It was a workhorse in party clothes that didn't fit. The 1958 Savoy wasn't bold or bad enough to be memorable. It was just there. A rolling reminder that mediocrity doesn't age well. Number 20. 1955 Chrysler 300. The 1955 Chrysler 300, often hailed as the first muscle car by the specs crowd, looked less like a street warrior and more like a refrigerator in formal wear. It had presence, no doubt, but the kind of presence that made you squint and ask, is that thing angry, bored, or just confused? Its body was long and slab-sided, like someone ironed all the curves out of it. It carried itself with the grace of a marching file cabinet, all squared off steel in brooding silence. Chrysler tried to sell it as a high-powered performance coupe with class, but the styling seemed to have missed the memo. The front looked heavy, weighed down by a grille that resembled an industrial furnace. The headlights were set into deep brows, giving it a permanently suspicious look, like it didn't trust the road beneath it. Around back, the tail fins were more like suggestions, short, awkward stubs, as if the designers ran out of enthusiasm halfway through the mold. Inside, it was a confusing blend of speed and senior living. Gauges were legible but uninspired. The dash was broad and flat, and everything felt like it belonged in a waiting room for retired pilots. The car had a Hemi, sure, but it was housed in a body that never looked like it should be moving fast. Driving it was like riding a charging bull wrapped in a mattress, powerful but not pretty. The 1955 Chrysler 300 might have had the guts, but it lacked the face. It was all business and no charm. A brute dressed as a banker, showing up to a race in wingtip shoes. Number 19. 1956 Ford Thunderbird. The 1956 Ford Thunderbird was supposed to be Ford's answer to Chevrolet's Corvette, but somewhere between ambition and execution, it tripped over its own chrome. Everyone remembers the Thunderbird as a sleek two-seater, dripping with cool, but the first redesign brought with it a set of problems that turned the car from dream to diva. The removable hardtop looked sharp, yes, but weighed as much as a rowboat and required a buddy, or three, to hoist it off. If you wanted open-air driving on a whim, you needed a wrench, a strong back, and a prayer. The so-called porthole windows added that space-age flair, but they were more fashion than function. Visibility was still lousy, and the styling cue felt like a gimmick nailed onto a problem no one had solved. The body, although curvy and clean, concealed all kinds of build headaches. Trunk space was laughable because the spare tire was mounted outside on the bumper like an afterthought. The Continental kit looked classy to some, but it made parking the thing feel like maneuvering a city bus. Under the hood, the V8 did its job, but the extra weight from the new features dulled its performance edge. Steering was vague, braking was average, and the car's balance felt off, like it didn't know whether it wanted to be a cruiser or a brawler. Water leaks through the seals were common, especially around the hardtop, giving owners the joy of mildew-scented upholstery after a rain. The 1956 Thunderbird looked the part but made you work for the illusion. It was stylish, no doubt, but not smart. A rolling contradiction, equal parts sculpture and struggle. Number 18. 1955 Pontiac Bonneville. The 1955 Pontiac Bonneville strutted onto the scene like a beauty queen who brought her own spotlight and fog machine. This was Pontiac's shot at glamour, and they weren't aiming for subtle. Chrome blanketed every surface as if the designers were paid by the inch. The grille stretched wide across the front like a sequin grin, while the side trim zigzagged like it was dodging bad decisions. And then there were the fins, those over-sculpted rear fins that soared skyward like cathedral spires, but looked completely unearned. Unlike Cadillac's confident tail treatment, Pontiac's felt bolted on in a panic to keep up with Detroit's fever for wings. From certain angles, the Bonneville looked like it was trying to lift off. From others, it just looked confused. Inside, Pontiac went for flashover function. The dashboard was a festival of knobs, chrome bezels, and fonts that seemed ripped from a retro diner menu. The upholstery, stitched in two-tone extravagance, managed to be both loud and lifeless. It was a convertible, yes, but the top mechanism was temperamental, and the seals didn't always do their job. Rain found its way in like an uninvited guest, and the electric gadgets often refused to cooperate. Underneath all that sparkle was a capable V8, but the Bonneville was heavy and slow to respond. It cruised well enough in a straight line, but throw it a corner and it waddled like a showboat in shallow water. The 1955 Bonneville wasn't a car, it was an audition for a parade. It wanted to be the star but didn't know how to shut up. A rolling spectacle that mistook glitter for greatness. Number 17. 1957 Cadillac Eldorado. The 1957 Cadillac Eldorado didn't just whisper wealth, it screamed it through a megaphone wrapped in gold leaf. It was Cadillac's flagship, the automotive equivalent of a chandelier strapped to a freight train. You couldn't look at it without feeling like it had a superiority complex baked right into the steel. The bodywork was festooned with chrome that looked like it had been applied with a fire hose, and the trim went on for miles. The rear fins were so sharply angled they looked like they could slice bread. The taillights, perched like jewels, were about as subtle as a trumpet solo in a library. Up front, the massive egg crate grille gave the impression that the car was trying to inhale everything in its path, including small pets and pedestrians. The entire car seemed designed by someone whose only direction was more. Inside, things didn't calm down. The interior looked like a casino lounge had been crammed into a car cabin, plush, overstuffed, and confused about restraint. The dash featured enough buttons and dials to control an aircraft carrier, many of which had vague or inconsistent labeling. Upholstery patterns clashed proudly, and the door panels had trim on top of trim. It was Cadillac trying to out-Cadillac itself, and in the process, the Eldorado tipped from elegant to operatic. Yes, it had a big engine. Yes, it moved with authority. But every motion felt more ceremonial than spirited. The 1957 Eldorado wasn't a car you drove, it was a rolling vanity mirror. Flashy, bloated, and absolutely convinced of its own importance. Number 16. 1959 Chevrolet Impala. The 1959 Chevrolet Impala rolled off the line like a carnival float that had lost its parade. It was the kind of car that didn't enter a parking lot quietly. It made an entrance like a rock star in platform shoes. Its tail fins didn't go up like most of the era's chrome-plated peacocks. Instead, they stretched outward like bat wings ready to take flight. From behind, it looked like it was trying to either fly or slap the road in frustration. Chevrolet didn't stop with just the fins. Up front, the bumper sprouted a set of chrome teeth that looked like the grille was trying to bite something. The headlights were stacked sideways, peering out from under a heavy brow that gave the car a permanently suspicious expression. And the body creases? They zigzagged like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. Inside, the dashboard was long enough to host a board meeting, and the steering wheel looked like a discarded amusement park ride. There were knobs and switches everywhere, none of them in a hurry to explain what they did. The upholstery tried to be space-age, but landed somewhere between sofa, fabric, and diner booth. Yes, you could get it with a big V8. And yes, it could hustle in a straight line. But the car was enormous, floaty, and difficult to park without a team of spotters and divine intervention. The 1959 Impala wasn't a car, it was a rolling fashion crisis. Loud, overdone, and convinced it was the coolest thing on the road, even as people stared for all the wrong reasons. Number 15. 1959 DeSoto Fire Sweep. The 1959 DeSoto Fire Sweep looked like it had been designed by a committee that couldn't agree on which direction the car should face. The tail fins, instead of soaring skyward or stretching outward like most of the decade's Chrome Warriors, angled strangely forward, like the car was trying to moonwalk. They didn't look sleek or futuristic. They looked confused, like a paper airplane thrown the wrong way. The front end was no better. The grille stretched wide, a gaping maw filled with enough horizontal bars to serve lunch at a prison cafeteria. It was the kind of face that looked permanently surprised, possibly even embarrassed to be on its own body. Headlights sat awkwardly high and far apart, as if the designers had placed them at the last second and hoped nobody would notice. Inside, the Fire Sweep tried its best to deliver mid-tier glamour, but the effort fell flat. The dashboard was cluttered, with gauges spread out like they'd been thrown in a game of roulette. Materials looked flashy but felt cheap, and the cabin had the sterile charm of a dentist's waiting room. Comfort was average, but the styling distracted from everything else. It was like wearing a velvet suit to take out the trash. Despite being built on a Chrysler platform and packing a decent engine, the Fire Sweep handled like a half-asleep elephant on roller skates. It was long, wide, and wandered through corners like it had something better to do. The 1959 DeSoto Fire Sweep was a car caught between eras, lost in its own styling experiment. It tried to be bold but ended up baffling. A strange goodbye from a brand already fading into the rear view. Number 14. 1959 Ford Fairlane. The 1959 Ford Fairlane was the kind of car that tried to blend in during a decade when blending in was a cardinal sin. While its competitors were sprouting wings, flashing chrome like a Vegas lounge act, and embracing absurdity with both arms, the Fairlane played it safe and paid the price in personality. Its body sat low and wide, but instead of coming off sleek, it just looked stretched and tired. It gave off strong, last-minute design energy, like the engineers ran out of ideas halfway through and just copied last year's sketch. The fins were there, sure, but they had all the confidence of someone trying to sneak into a party they weren't invited to. Not bold, not subtle, just awkward. The front grille looked like a sideways filing cabinet, and the headlights were tucked into bezels that gave the car a slack-jawed expression. Even the name Fairlane promised more flair than the sheet metal delivered. Inside, it didn't get much better. The interior was dressed in plastics pretending to be metal and fabrics pretending to be luxurious. The dashboard was functional in the way a steel lunch tray is functional. It held stuff, but you wouldn't call it elegant. Ford tried to appeal to the middle-class family man, but the Fairlane lacked excitement, charm, or even a strong opinion about anything. Performance? Adequate, if uninspired. Handling? About as tight as a shopping cart with a wobbly wheel. The 1959 Fairlane was a filler car, a placeholder between Ford's bolder ideas. Not offensive, not impressive, just there. A rolling sigh on four wheels. Number 13. 1954 Kaiser Manhattan. The 1954 Kaiser Manhattan looked like someone threw every design trend of the decade into a blender and poured the results over a stretched sedan. It had bulk, it had chrome, it had creases, but none of it knew where to go. The roof sat too tall, giving the entire car a gawky, bubble-headed silhouette that screamed uncertain teenager in formal wear. Its hood was long, its deck was short, and the sides were littered with trim that seemed to exist purely to keep the metal from looking naked. From the front, the grille was a wide, toothy grin that managed to be both too plain and too smug. The headlights sat in bezels that felt like leftovers from another car entirely. Every panel had a line, a crease, a dip, or a bulge, never working together, always arguing. It was as if the design team didn't edit, they just added more. Inside, the story didn't improve. Kaiser loved to tout its safety padding and luxury touches, but most of the interior looked like it was stitched together by someone who had only seen pictures of Cadillacs from a distance. Gauges were plain, switchgear felt clunky, and the upholstery had patterns that looked like motel wallpaper. The Manhattan might have been roomy, but it felt like a padded room, lots of space, no soul. Mechanically, it was serviceable. But in a decade where style sold cars, the 1954 Manhattan showed up wearing every outfit in its closet at once. It was over-accessorized, underdeveloped, and hard to look at without tilting your head. A design stew that boiled over. Number 12. 1958 AMC Rambler. The 1958 AMC Rambler looked like the automotive version of dry toast, technically functional, but absolutely devoid of flavor. Born out of necessity rather than inspiration, this was AMC's attempt to serve up something affordable, sensible, and straightforward. What they delivered instead was a sedan that looked like it had been drawn with a ruler and a grudge. The body was as flat as a boarding house pancake, with boxy proportions that didn't suggest economy so much as defeat. Its styling was honest to a fault. No curves, no character, no hint that a human being with creative instincts had been involved in the design process. The grille was a wide, uninspired rectangle, like a mailbox slot wearing chrome lipstick. The headlights sat there with all the enthusiasm of flickering hallway bulbs. Even the trim looked reluctant, just enough to say, "We tried," but not enough to convince anyone they meant it. Inside, things didn't improve. The dashboard was a slab with dials, the seats were stiff, and the cabin smelled like missed opportunities. Every surface whispered budget cuts. Even the horn button looked like it gave up halfway through development. The engine was modest, the handling was forgettable, and the ride quality sat somewhere between acceptable and please make it stop. The 1958 Rambler didn't offend the eye, it just gave it nothing to care about. It wasn't daring, it wasn't graceful, it wasn't even ugly enough to be interesting. It was a car built by accountants and marketed to people who had run out of reasons to say no. A beige brick rolling through a decade obsessed with flash. Number 11. 1959 AMC Rebel. The 1959 AMC Rebel wasn't ugly enough to be mocked, nor smart enough to be admired. It just sort of existed, like a phone book or canned peas. It tried to be a bridge between practicality and performance, but ended up as a shrug on wheels. AMC slapped the Rebel name on it as if that alone would give it attitude. But one glance told you this thing had never rebelled against anything in its life. Not style, not convention, not even mediocrity. The car's design was as bold as a beige wall. Its body panels were straight and lifeless. The wheel arches were timid, and the trim was so cautious it might as well have apologized for showing up. From the front, it looked like someone took a generic sedan and tried to jazz it up by gluing on some rectangles. The grille had all the charm of a kitchen vent, and the headlights stared ahead like a deer unsure whether to cross the road. The inside was no less forgettable. Bench seats with zero support, an instrument panel designed by someone who clearly hated instruments, and a steering wheel that felt like it had been borrowed from a tractor. Materials were cheap, even by economy car standards, and the whole cabin gave off the ambiance of a bus terminal waiting area. Performance? You could get a V8, but the body was so uninspired, it felt like a waste. The 1959 Rebel wasn't a bad car, it was worse. It was forgettable. A ghost of a car that left no mark, took no risks, and disappeared into the background before anyone could even complain. Number 10. 1954 Studebaker Champion. The 1954 Studebaker Champion looked like someone had taken a soap bar, flattened it, and then decided, yeah, this'll do. Once known for daring post-war styling, Studebaker by this point had settled into a kind of sleepy stupor, and the Champion bore the full weight of that creative coma. The lines were dead straight, the body panels flat as plywood, and the roof sat on the car like a cereal box lid. There wasn't a single exciting contour anywhere, just a long, quiet surrender to simplicity. Up front, it wore a generic face that looked like it had been copy-pasted from a design leftover bin. The grille was a plain, horizontal affair with no personality, and the headlights were round because, well, they had to be. There was no charm, no aggression, no boldness, just two eyes and a mouth on a body that didn't care what decade it was in. Inside, things stayed just as lifeless. Dashboard design? If you liked blank surfaces and occasional knobs, you were in luck. The speedometer looked like it had been stolen from a kitchen appliance, and the materials felt like leftovers from a city bus upholstery shop. Rear passengers got a bench and not much else. Performance was modest at best, courtesy of a straight-six engine that made just enough power to keep it from being overtaken by bicycles. Handling was about as sharp as a jelly sandwich. The 1954 Champion didn't offend the senses, it just put them to sleep. A car so aggressively plain, it made wallpaper seem adventurous. It wasn't designed. It was tolerated. Number 9. 1958 Lincoln Continental Mark IV. The 1958 Lincoln Continental Mark IV wasn't a car, it was a mobile monument to poor judgment. It measured over 227 inches long and looked like it had been carved from a shipping container. This thing didn't park so much as dock. Designed during a time when XS was still considered vision, the Mark IV doubled down on everything: size, chrome, bulk, and then threw subtlety off a cliff. The front end came at you like a battering ram in a tuxedo. A massive rectangular grille sat between quad headlights that looked like searchlights pulled from a naval destroyer. The bumper stuck out so far, you'd think it had ambitions of becoming a diving board. From the side, it had more flat acreage than some Midwestern farms, with slab-sided panels broken only by trim that seemed applied with a yardstick and blindfold. The tail end was a mess of fins and confusion, trying to look advanced but landing somewhere between radio tower and fishtail. The trunk lid was about the size of a ping-pong table, and closing it required either muscle or divine assistance. Inside, the car promised presidential luxury, but most of it felt more padded than posh. The controls were scattered, the dash was a steel wasteland, and the upholstery leaned hard into early retirement suite. Underneath the miles of sheet metal was a big V8 that could barely get this barge to hustle. Steering was vague, braking was dramatic, and corners were approached like philosophical suggestions. The 1958 Mark IV wasn't a car. It was a slow-moving sculpture, built to impress at a distance and disappoint up close. Number 8. 1958 Oldsmobile 98. The 1958 Oldsmobile 98 looked like it had lost a fight with a chrome factory and somehow walked away proud of it. This was not a car designed with restraint. It was designed by someone who had clearly bet their job on using up every last inch of shiny metal in the warehouse. From the front bumper to the back tail fin, it was a never-ending stream of glitter, curves, and bulges, each more confused than the last. The grille alone looked like it belonged on a cathedral pipe organ. It stretched across the face like a metallic scream, housing quad headlights that stared forward with all the warmth of interrogation lamps. Along the sides, chrome trims sliced through the body in swoops and arrows, some doubling back on themselves, like they'd gotten lost mid-sketch. The rear was no less chaotic. Fins poked skyward like angry eyebrows, and the taillights looked like red ice cream scoops jammed into rocket housings. Inside, the over-decoration continued. The dashboard gleamed like a jukebox, crowded with dials and accents that seemed to exist purely to distract from their actual functions. Upholstery patterns clashed like two different hotel lobbies merged during a blackout. Every surface tried to make a statement, and none of them agreed on what that statement was. Mechanically, the 98 wasn't awful. It had a big V8 and plenty of torque, but all that mass made it drive like a circus elephant in sequins. It lumbered, it wallowed, and it did so while covered in more reflective surfaces than a house of mirrors. The 1958 98 was less a car and more a rolling art project gone rogue. Number 7. 1959 Studebaker Lark. The 1959 Studebaker Lark was supposed to be the company's comeback kid, a compact car to save the brand from the quicksand of bankruptcy. Instead, it became a punchline parked in plain sight. With a name like Lark, you'd expect something light, joyful, maybe even clever. What rolled off the line looked like a full-size sedan that had been run through a shrinking machine, unevenly. The roof sat oddly high, as if it had been yanked up by a crane, giving the car a bloated greenhouse that made passengers look like they were sitting in a display case. The front end was generic to the point of anonymity, with a grille that looked like a deflated accordion and headlights spaced as if trying to avoid each other. Proportions were just off. It was short but tall, stubby but somehow stretched, the visual equivalent of a mismatched outfit worn with confidence and zero irony. Inside, the cabin was roomy for a compact, but felt like it had been furnished entirely from the discount bin section of a hardware store. Controls were basic, the dash was flat as a countertop, and everything had the tactile excitement of a dial-up modem. Even the horn sounded tired. Yes, it sold decently at first, mostly because it was cheap and didn't fall apart immediately. But the Lark never escaped the shadows of better-looking, better-built rivals. The public eventually gave it the unfortunate nickname Studebaker, a jab that stuck harder than any marketing campaign Studebaker ever paid for. The 1959 Lark didn't crash and burn. It tripped, mumbled an apology, and faded from the room while everyone looked elsewhere. Number 6. 1958 Packard Hawk. The 1958 Packard Hawk was supposed to be a swan song, but it came out sounding like a car choking on its own styling. Built during the final gasps of the Packard name, this Frankenstein ride was basically a Studebaker Golden Hawk underneath, dressed up in costume, jewelry, and denial. The most infamous part? That front end? A sloped fiberglass nose that looked like it had been melted with a heat gun and slapped on 5 minutes before launch. From the side, the car had promise. But walk to the front and you'd swear the designers had switched teams halfway through. The low, protruding nose didn't match the rest of the body. It clashed violently, like a tuxedo with clown shoes. The mesh grille, scooped hood, and drooping headlamps gave the Packard Hawk a look of permanent confusion, like it couldn't remember why it was built in the first place. The interior was at odds with itself. It tried to channel European grand touring charm, but ended up feeling like a second-hand cocktail lounge. Gauges were crammed into an oddly curved dashboard, and the steering wheel looked borrowed from something that should have stayed in the boatyard. Yes, it had a supercharged V8 under the hood, but good luck getting anyone to care when the car looked like a low-budget Batmobile in daylight. Only a few hundred were made, and most people who saw them wondered if they were prototypes that accidentally escaped the design studio. The 1958 Packard Hawk wasn't ahead of its time. It wasn't behind it either. It was just lost. A strange coda for a once-proud badge, delivered in the key of awkward. Number 5. 1957 Studebaker Scotsman. The 1957 Studebaker Scotsman wasn't so much designed as it was cost-cut into existence. It was what happened when a car company tried to make an entire vehicle using only 3 crayons and a budget smaller than a vending machine refund. Studebaker, gasping for air in a shrinking market, decided to build something that didn't just compete on price. It wrestled price to the floor and kicked it until it tapped out. Everything non-essential was deleted. No chrome. No shine. The grille? Painted metal slats? The bumpers? Steel bars with the personality of scaffolding. Door handles, hubcaps, trim, gone or downgraded. The Scotsman didn't even pretend to care about looking good. It was beige on wheels, the visual equivalent of store-brand cereal. The shape itself was awkwardly square, boxy enough to pass for a shipping crate with turn signals. There were no curves, no effort, just panel after panel of flat sheet metal stitched together with a straight edge. It made mid-century modernism look baroque. Inside, things were even bleaker. Bench seats were vinyl-clad slabs. The dash looked like it had been lifted from an industrial lathe. No radio, no frills, no nonsense, just a steering wheel and some gauges to remind you that yes, this was technically a car. And yet, it sold. People bought the Scotsman because it was cheap and ran fine, but nobody dreamed about owning one. The 1957 Scotsman was a rolling austerity plan, a car so plain it almost looped back around to fascinating. Almost. Mostly, it just looked like a cardboard box someone forgot to decorate. Number 4. 1956 Studebaker Hawk. The 1956 Studebaker Hawk looked like it had taken design advice from a jukebox and a coffin and followed both. This was supposed to be a bold, fresh take on personal performance, but it ended up looking like the stylist ran out of patience and just bolted on whatever was lying around. The most talked about feature was that front grille, a massive upright slab that resembled a tombstone made of metal lattice. It didn't blend with the rest of the car. It just sat there, daring you to find it attractive. The body itself had potential, with long, flowing lines left over from the Golden Hawk, but Studebaker couldn't leave well enough alone. They went chrome happy. Trim was plastered across the sides in clunky bands, creating weird breaks in the bodywork that didn't follow any logic other than more is better. Fins sprouted out back, not soaring and elegant like a Cadillac's, but short, stumpy things that looked like they'd been added at the last minute with duct tape and optimism. Inside, the cabin tried to pass as upscale, but it had all the charm of a discount furniture showroom. The dashboard was a flat slab with gauges jammed in like an afterthought, and the seats had enough padding to make you feel like you were sitting in a padded cell. Nothing flowed, nothing matched. It was a patchwork of ideas, all shouting over each other. The 1956 Hawk had the power to move, sure, but it wore its ambition like an ill-fitting suit. Flashy, bloated, and confused about what it wanted to be. A car that looked like it was trying to impress you, while slowly collapsing under its own decoration. Number 3. 1953 Kaiser Dragon. The 1953 Kaiser Dragon was what happened when someone took the phrase luxury car a little too literally and then ran straight off a cliff with it. With its faux reptile skin roof and gold-plated nameplates, the Dragon didn't whisper elegance, it hissed it from across the parking lot. The vinyl top was embossed to resemble dragon hide, which, depending on your level of imagination, either looked like mythical armor or the back of a greasy diner menu. But Kaiser didn't stop with just a weird roof. Oh no. They decided to gild the lily by adding gold-colored trim on the outside and piping on the seats thick enough to trip over. The interior was a fever dream of brocade, fringe, and whatever else they could sew onto a seat without breaking the springs. The dashboard was a mess of textures and colors, like someone had designed it with their eyes closed and a handful of fabric samples. Mechanically, the Dragon didn't breathe fire. It wheezed with a 6-cylinder engine that might have been fine in a taxi, but had no business dragging around this much attitude. The ride was soft enough to rock you to sleep, and cornering felt like herding a mattress down a water slide. It wasn't quick, it wasn't agile, it was just odd. The 1953 Dragon wasn't just flamboyant. It was theatrical in all the wrong ways. A car so desperate to be seen, it forgot to ask whether people were laughing with it or at it. And most of the time, they were doing the latter. Number 2. 1952 Nash Healey. The 1952 Nash Healey looked like it was halfway through devouring a smaller vehicle and then got caught in the act. Its inboard headlights and narrow grille gave the front end a puckered, imploding look, as if the car was trying to suck its own face into itself. Nash wanted a sleek European sports car to impress American buyers, so they teamed up with British engineering and Italian coachwork, and then stuffed it all into a body that looked deeply confused. The front grille sat awkwardly low and pinched, flanked by headlights that seemed reluctant to face forward. The proportions were all wrong, the hood too tall, the body too flat, the fenders too tentative. From the side, it had promise. But once you circled around to the front, the illusion shattered like a drop tray of espresso cups. Inside, it was a mishmash of cultures and compromises. The cabin was cramped, with mismatched gauges and upholstery that tried for elegance but landed somewhere closer to theatrical. The steering wheel was oversized, the pedals were oddly spaced, and visibility felt like peering out of a mailbox. Power came from a Nash inline-six, reliable but uninspired, which meant the Nash Healey had the performance bark of a sports car and the bite of a park bench. Handling was decent for the time, but it was all wrapped in a face that looked like it was reacting to bad news. The 1952 Nash Healey wanted to be exotic. Instead, it became a cautionary tale in styling gone sideways. It looked like it was inhaling its own regrets, one chrome detail at a time. Number 1. 1958 Ford Edsel Pacer. The 1958 Ford Edsel Pacer didn't just miss the mark, it missed the entire shooting range and set fire to the rulebook on its way down. What was supposed to be a bold new division of Ford ended up looking like the automotive version of a nervous breakdown. And right at the center of that disaster was the Pacer, proudly wearing the most unfortunate face in car history. That vertical grille, forever etched in the collective memory of car lovers and comedians alike, was less a design choice and more a cry for help. Shaped like a toilet seat or a horse collar depending on your angle, it dominated the front like a punchline nobody asked for. It looked like the car was trying to inhale the road in front of it, and choking. The rest of the body didn't help. Overcomplicated lines met at awkward angles, with fins that couldn't decide whether to soar or slouch. Trim wandered across the sheet metal like it was looking for an exit. The two-tone paint options clashed with the curves in ways that made the Pacer look like a melting parade float. Inside, it was a circus of bad ideas. The push-button transmission was mounted in the steering wheel hub, cool in theory, terrifying in execution. The materials were mid-grade at best, and the layout felt like it had been designed by someone trying to win a dare. The 1958 Edsel Pacer didn't just fail. It imploded with flair. A masterclass in how too much hype, bad timing, and a face only a factory could love can turn a car into a national punchline.